Syria suspends evacuations from eastern Aleppo amid claims the rebels have broken the terms of the ceasefire. Thousands did leave the besieged area, but tension was high, with gunfire heard as the convoys left. We'll be speaking to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, who's been closely following events from the region. Also this lunchtime, 2 former soldiers are to be prosecuted for murder in relation to the shooting of an IRA man in Belfast in 1972. President Obama threatens retaliation against Russia over its alleged hacking to influence the presidential election. A record £3 million fine for the national lottery operator Camelot after allegations it paid out to a fraudulent prize claim. And we freeze a moment in time at an accident and emergency unit to explain the pressures on the NHS.
Here, a schoolgirl sentenced to 10 years in detention for the attempted murder of her friend. And survivors of the Ufton Nervet rail disaster will open a new bridge 12 years after their lives were changed forever.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The evacuation of civilians and fighters from eastern Aleppo has been suspended by the Syrian government. The reasons for this suspension are unclear, although the Syrian government has accused rebels of breaking their side of the deal. However, Russia says the operation is complete, with nearly 10,000 people taken out of the city. There was gunfire this morning as buses carried people out of eastern Aleppo, and the World Health Organization says there are still high numbers of women and children there waiting to be evacuated. Here's our correspondent, Richard Lister.
For a while today, it seemed like the evacuation would continue. Another convoy of exhausted people left eastern Aleppo under the watchful eyes of Russian troops. Their lives packed into suitcases and plastic bags, they were finally heading to safety. Others nearby were preparing to leave too. A TV reporter was setting up next to them, but then this. Gunfire somewhere close. Those waiting to leave know that sound all too well. They began streaming from the buses to find cover. The aid agencies that had gathered at checkpoints were ordered to leave. The evacuation was halted. At a UN briefing in Geneva, a field worker said by phone from Aleppo that many women and children were still trapped in the city.
They have been collecting themselves on the point where the buses and the ambulances were waiting for them. But now with the operation aborted, they will have to go back to their houses. And this is a great concern to us because we know that they are desperate to get out.
Some did manage to get out overnight. With hospitals near Aleppo now overloaded, these injured children were brought across the border for treatment in Turkey. Other evacuees were bussed into areas west of the city, which are still in opposition hands. We left Aleppo completely broken, he said. Exactly why the evacuation stopped is unclear, but pro-government sources say rebel groups haven't lifted the siege of 2 Shia villages, Kafraya and Fua, which was part of the ceasefire deal. So what next? The US insists overall peace talks in Geneva are still the best way forward.
The only remaining question is whether the Syrian regime, with Russia's support, is willing to go to Geneva, prepared to negotiate constructively.
But it's this man, Russia's President Vladimir Putin, who's calling the shots when it comes to how Syria will proceed. He's now talking about setting up new peace talks in Kazakhstan.
We'll propose that the 2 sides of the conflict continue peace negotiations in a new place, and the Kazakh capital Astana could be such a place.
Russia says the Syrian army now controls all of eastern Aleppo, but pockets of fighting continue, and Moscow says no more rebels will be helped to leave. The future of the civilians left in this broken city is still unclear. Richard Lister, BBC News.
Well, let's speak now to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, who's in Beirut for us. Lise, this is a stop-start evacuation in a very tense atmosphere. How do you read the situation now?
Rita, it was always going to be a mission fraught with difficulty and a great dose of danger. What has happened is, even though the bombardment and shelling has ended, the war is now being waged through these 2 evacuation missions that are being carried out. There's a rescue mission which is supposed to be taking place in the 2 villages in the north which are besieged by the opposition, at the same time as there is this mission to take out the fighters, the civilians, the ill and the injured from eastern Aleppo. And yet again, it is the civilians who are trapped between the warring sides. Everyone on the side of the war, on each side of this war, seems to be trying to extract their last concessions, their last bit of revenge before the battle for Aleppo is well and truly over. You've been seeing the absolutely desperate scenes of the civilians, and in particular those who've been injured and ill, who've been waiting for weeks to get out of that last hellish corner of East Aleppo, which has been under such intense bombardment and shelling for so long. A Red Cross official yesterday who was on the scene said never has she seen people who've had to suffer so much in this situation. So now it is again on hold, and it's very hard to say when any of the evacuations will get underway again.
Lise, thank you. Lise Doucet there. In the last few minutes, it's been announced that 2 former members of the Parachute Regiment are to be prosecuted for murder over the fatal shooting of a man in Belfast in 1972. Well, let's speak now to our Ireland correspondent Chris Buckler. And Chris, tell us more about what happened.
Joe McCann was a member of the official IRA, and he was shot dead just about a mile away from here on Joy Street in Belfast back in 1972. And there has been a fresh investigation into exactly what happened. And the focus has really been on an army patrol, and specifically 3 members of it. 2 of those soldiers are still alive, and today the Public Prosecution Service announced that they would be prosecuted for murder, a decision they made clear that was conducted in accordance with the Code for Prosecutors and an impartial application of the test for prosecution. Over the last decade, detectives have been investigating all of the many killings that took place during years of violence in Northern Ireland. A period referred to as the Troubles, a title that doesn't reflect the reality of the conflict that was taking place on its streets. Joe McCann was a leader of the official IRA. This is him pictured masked and armed in the early 1970s.
Forward, march!
A year later, he was killed in Belfast, shot by the army as he ran away from the police. He was wanted, but he was not armed, and his family have long pushed for new prosecutions in connection with his death. A point they emphasised when a report into his killing by the Historical Inquiries team was published almost 4 years ago. After reviewing the files, today the Public Prosecution Service announced that 2 members of the army, known only as Soldier A and C, are to be prosecuted for murder. That followed a referral by Northern Ireland's Attorney General. And with police reinvestigating many of the other killings during the Troubles, it's likely the past will continue to have an impact on the present. In recent weeks, Conservative and Unionist politicians have been very vocal in their concerns about these investigations into the past and the potential of members of the security forces being prosecuted. However, I have to say both the PPS and the police have made clear that there is no witch hunt.
Chris, thank you. Chris Buckler there. The war of words between Washington and Moscow has intensified after reports that Russia launched a cyber attack against the US to influence the outcome of the presidential election. President Obama said the attack couldn't have happened without the knowledge of President Putin, and he said the United States must and would retaliate. Here's our Washington correspondent, Laura Bicker.
Thank you to the incredible people of Pennsylvania. Thank you. Thank you.
The president-elect is defiant. As he tours the country to thank voters, he's dismissing claims that Vladimir Putin helped put him in the White House. But the Obama administration made Russian hacking claims public several months ago. Now they say the Russian president was directly involved in the operation, which targeted the emails of Hillary Clinton's closest aides. Mr. Obama gave this response to NPR Radio.
I think there is no doubt that when any foreign government tries to impact the integrity of our elections, that we need to take action. and we will at a time and place of our own choosing.
Earlier, the White House press secretary pointed a finger at Mr. Putin.
Based on my personal reading, and not based on any knowledge that I have that may be classified or otherwise, pretty obvious that they were referring to the senior-most government official in Russia.
Vladimir Putin has always denied the accusations and said they were laughable nonsense. No proof has ever been made public.
I was shocked when I saw this news on the television. I have nothing to add. I think that the stupidity and hopelessness of such an attempt to convince the people of this is obvious.
The dispute over Russia's role in the election is overshadowing Mr. Trump's transition. The president-elect and the president do not agree on who is responsible or how to act. Laura Bicker, BBC News, Washington.
A former Royal Marine is in court today for a hearing he hopes will lead to him being released on bail while he waits for an appeal into his case to be heard. Sergeant Alexander Blackman, known as Marine A during his murder trial, is serving a life sentence for shooting dead a wounded Afghan insurgent in 2011. His legal team say he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder at the time. Robert Hall reports.
A September day in 2011. A helmet camera worn by a member of Marine Sergeant Al Blackman's squad captures the moment they find a wounded insurgent, one of two men who'd attacked their base. Moments later, a shot rings out.
Nothing you would do to us.
I know.
Exactly. All right. Obviously, this doesn't go anywhere, fellas.
Yeah, roger, mate.
I've just broken Geneva Convention.
Yeah, roger.
At his court-martial, Sergeant Blackman was told he'd disgraced the name of the British Armed Forces. He spent the past 3 years at Earlstoke Prison in Wiltshire, as family and supporters argue that Sergeant Blackman's mental state and weaknesses in the prosecution case mean the murder conviction is unsound.
Had he been charged with manslaughter, the technicality of making a bad mistake, but nevertheless a mistake, he would probably have got 3 or so years. Halve it for good behaviour, he'd be out already. He's done 3 years in prison, possibly for a crime he never committed. I think that sticks in the craw of an awful lot of British people.
But others believe that even in the brutal combat of Afghanistan, the laws of warfare must be adhered to.
I, as serving as a soldier, I have been in a similar situation where one of my soldiers wanted to shoot a wounded prisoner. They didn't, I hasten to add, but it's completely unacceptable in all circumstances unless the guy turns out to be mentally ill. If he's not mentally ill, he should be in prison. I'm sorry, even if he is a hero, but if he was mentally ill, then clearly he should be treated very differently.
Awaiting a decision from today's hearing, Sergeant Blackman's wife and family have learnt not to raise their hopes prematurely.
Trying to be cautiously optimistic. I think enjoying everybody else's enthusiasm and positive thoughts that we're being sent thick and fast, which is lovely. But I think for us, we've had that many knockbacks along the way to date that we don't count our chickens. Let's keep everything crossed and hope that Friday's decision is the one we want. That's as much as we can do.
Whatever the outcome this afternoon, the next stage in this legal battle is still many months away. Robert Hall, BBC News.
The operator of the National Lottery, Camelot, has been fined £3 million after paying a prize claim which it's thought might have been fraudulent. The Gambling Commission won't say exactly what happened, but it's thought to have involved a deliberately damaged ticket. Camelot called it a unique one-off incident which couldn't happen again. Well, our business correspondent John Moylan is with me now. So, John, details are sketchy. Do we know what happened?
No, but this morning this is already being dubbed the Great Lottery Robbery. As you say, it seems to have involved a deliberately damaged ticket that was presented to Camelot back in 2009 and which led to a payout of £2.5 million. Fresh evidence emerged which cast doubt on all of this last year. It led to an investigation. The police have been involved and the investigation found failings in Camelot's systems. And of course, the fraud meant that £2.5 million then did not go forward to good causes. And I think that's reflected in this penalty, this fine, this £3 million fine, which is the largest that's ever been handed down to Camelot by the Gambling Commission.
And what more are Camelot saying about what happened?
Well, they claim that this is a unique one-off event. The police have been involved, and because there could still be a criminal investigation in the future, they're not giving any more details. But they've looked at their processes involving this business of deliberately damaged tickets, and they have found no evidence of similar cases. They say this couldn't happen today because of controls that they have in place. But you have to say it's more bad news for Camelot. Just last month, they said that they thought thousands of the customer accounts had been hacked. They've run the National Lottery since it launched back in 1994. The licence is up for renewal in 4 years' time. So I think this will all put pressure on the firm.
OK, John, thank you. The time is 1:15. Our top story this lunchtime. Syria suspends evacuations from eastern Aleppo amid claims the rebels have broken the terms of the ceasefire. And still to come, they may have lost the series, but England make a strong start in the final test match against India.
Stay with us here on BBC One for South Today. Holly Green will be here with that all-important weekend weather forecast, plus spreading Christmas cheer on the children's ward. The man giving children a Christmassy window on the world. All that and more in around 15 minutes.
The chronic shortage of beds in England's hospitals is increasing the risk of infection, according to the Nuffield Trust charity. It says that last winter, over 95% of beds were used every day, forcing hospitals to open thousands more. So why the shortage? Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes went to the set of the BBC drama Casualty and froze a moment in time to help explain why A&E departments are under so much pressure.
Welcome to our A&E Mannequin Challenge. Now, we're trying to show some of the pressures that A&Es are under right across the UK as they go into winter. Now, obviously, we couldn't do this in a real emergency department, but the good people at Casualty have lent us their set, and we've staffed it with volunteers from University Hospital Wales here in Cardiff. So let's see what we've got. First up, we've got some people who really don't need to be in A&E at all. These young ladies have been out on the lash, been out for Christmas drinks, they've had too much to drink, and they've wound up here, but they shouldn't really be here. They're clogging up A&E. But here's someone who absolutely does, a frail, elderly gentleman. He's probably got breathing difficulties, he's got a whole load of things wrong with him, and it's the growing number of frail elderly people that is becoming a real issue for A&Es across the country. And that means often people are having to wait a very long time. This lady here has been waiting for hours to be seen. She's very frustrated. Meanwhile, this nurse on the phone is desperately trying to find beds for people like that frail elderly man who might have to be admitted. But bed shortages are becoming a real issue. Another big problem is recruitment into A&E itself. So here's a senior nurse talking to an agency nurse, instructing her on how the department runs. But the recruitment and retention of junior and mid-level staff, both doctors and nurses, is a real issue in A&E. Now over here, this is what accident and emergency is all about. This is what those departments were designed for. This is a real emergency, someone who is very sick indeed. But look at the number of people in this room. This is what really sucks up staff and resources, and that is why sometimes people have to face those very long waits because a number of emergencies might all come in at the same time. One more issue just out here, violence against staff caused by drugs, alcohol and just bad behaviour. People coming in and assaulting staff can be a real issue for those working in A&E. So what can be done? Well, some hospitals are putting GPs in their A&Es to try and divert those who don't need to be here. Other hospitals are working very closely with social services to try and help those frail elderly people get back into the community, get back into their houses as soon as they can. But there are things we can all do as patients as well. We can avoid coming to A&E unless it's absolutely necessary and think very carefully before we wind up in hospital.
Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes there. A jury has convicted the oldest defendant ever to stand trial in a British court. Ralph Clark, who's 101, was found guilty of more than 20 offences of child sex abuse which occurred in the 1970s and 80s. He also admitted other charges. Well, let's cross now to our correspondent Phil Mackey, who's at Birmingham Crown Court for us now. Phil.
Yes, Rita, his three victims were in court as those unanimous verdicts were read out. Two of them were in tears. as two little girls and a young boy. They'd been abused by Ralph Clark for nearly a decade between the mid-1970s and the early 1980s. And finally today they were here to see him brought to justice. Making his way slowly into court, Ralph Clark might look like a frail old man, but 40 years ago this 101-year-old former lorry driver terrified the young children he horrifically sexually abused, and today he was finally brought to justice. During the trial, his victims had to give quite intimate details of the terrible abuse they suffered at the hands of Ralph Clark, something that's had a deep impact on their lives ever since. It took many years to get the courage to come and speak to the police. It was only last year, when they saw a notification about Clark's 100th birthday, that they finally decided to do so. The court did make special arrangements for Clark, only operating for half days and not making him sit in the dock so he could hear proceedings more easily. But prosecutors described him as lucid with an excellent memory. Recent years have seen a rise in the reporting of historic child sex abuse, and police hope the publicity around this case will encourage more victims to come forward.
The questions were asked, is it in the public interest? Well, of course it is. The day that not prosecuting somebody who hurts a child is not in the public interest, we may as well all just pack up and go home. His victims are members of the public. They deserve, even after all this time, the justice that they're entitled to.
During the trial, Clark did admit some of the offences, but he never expressed any real remorse. He's now become Britain's oldest convicted criminal. And he'll be sentenced on Monday, Rita. He's been remanded in custody until then. Judge Richard Bond said that he needed to ponder with care about the sentence. He said the reality is he's unlikely, given his age, that he will ever be released back into the community. But he said that the public would be horrified if he wasn't sent to prison. So we'll be back here on Monday to find out for how long. Rita.
Phil, thank you. Another day and more misery for thousands of passengers on Southern Rail. Every one of the company's 2,000 services has been cancelled today because of a strike by drivers over changes to the role of the train guard. And they're due to go on strike again next week. Well, let's speak now to our transport correspondent Richard Westcott, who's in an almost deserted Victoria station in London. Richard, what is the scale of the disruption?
I think you've summed it up there, actually. I think a lot of people have stayed away. Talking to the staff here, they're saying, actually, Victoria's been pretty quiet. There've even been some shops that haven't bothered opening today because they're not doing the same levels of business that they would normally do. It's hardly surprising, really. Although it's the third strike day this week, there was a gap in between of one day, but the trains were still very bad because after strikes, they all end up in the wrong place. There's also an overtime ban going on and a work to rule from the drivers. So passengers have endured 4 really nasty days this week. As you say, it goes on next week. It's the conductors on strike next week for a couple of days. Now, that doesn't have quite the same impact on services because there are fewer of them, but it still has a big impact. There's still this overtime ban. And when you talk to people who use Southern all the time anyway, they keep stressing to me the service was terrible anyway. Regardless of the strikes, it was part of a franchise that was the worst performing franchise in Britain. We had talks yesterday between the drivers' union and the company. They broke down. It's all got a bit punchy on both sides. It's very hard to see when this strike's going to end, and there are just more now between now and Christmas, and then a nasty 6-day strike starting on January the 9th. So I'm sure people will be desperate for some kind of resolution. Frankly, I can't see where that's going to come at the moment.
Richard, thank you. Richard Westcott there. Now, every year, thousands of people are tricked into transferring money from their bank to fraudsters. Often it's when you think you're paying for a holiday, building work or a deposit on a house. But today, the banking regulator has rejected a call from the consumer group Which that banks should be forced to compensate the victims. Here's our personal finance correspondent, Simon Gompertz.
It's the new scourge of the internet age. Fraudsters posing as someone you really do expect to be paying and tricking you into transferring the money to them. Matt Larson in Liverpool thought he had paid £800 for him and his friends to stay in Amsterdam, but he was duped into doing a bank transfer into a fraudulent account.
I genuinely did think with stuff like this, you will get the money back. And I told myself, and my friends told me, Matt, don't worry about it, we'll get it back, we're just going to go to another hostel now and it'll be fine. And we did, we got back. Obviously I tried to claim and we got nothing.
And the regulator confirmed today that banks shouldn't have to compensate victims like Matt, though it'll keep the issue under review. That's after Which demanded that banks should pay up.
The regulators agreed that there is a big problem here. Unfortunately, they've let the banks off the hook. This is a real problem and banks should be more liable for protecting consumers from this sort of fraud.
This is the nub of it. The payment page of your bank account where you'd put in as the victim the sort code and the bank account number of the fraudster, not knowing that the receiving bank has allowed a fraudster to set up an account, or that it could take ages for the receiving account to be frozen, by which time your money has disappeared. Banks have promised action. When you transfer funds, a message with the real name attached to the fraudulent account will pop up asking if you still want to go ahead. But should banks do more? If a bank allows a fraudster to open an account which is used for a fraud, shouldn't the bank be the one who has to pay?
So we want to make sure that banks are doing everything they can to protect consumers, really make it as hard as possible for this type of fraud to be committed. That's why we're pushing the banks to do this work. When we've got the evidence, we obviously take the necessary action.
Banks admit that hundreds of thousands of people may have lost out to bank transfer fraud. They've agreed to share more information and tighten security. Simon Gompertz, BBC News.
Cricket now, and England may already have lost the series in India, but they made a strong start to the fourth and final test in Chennai today. The match had been threatened by extreme weather in the area, but England closed the first day 284 for 4. Joe Wilson was watching.
This is what Chennai had to contend with this week. Even the day before the test match, cyclone debris was all around the cricket ground. To get the game on was an achievement, and for India, soon worth it. So far for England, Keaton Jennings has scored 3 figures or 1. Here, 1. Ravi Jadeja bowled to Alistair Cook and got him again, 10 made by the captain. Now, Joe Root will take over as skipper at some point. Here, Root looked comfortably formidable as he got to 50. Root on 88, a flurry. Well, how was that? Well, Joe Root hadn't hit the ball, had he? Look at that little waveform diagram, a spike. That was a noise. That was the bat on the ball. Oh, he's out. Frustrated? Shake it off, as they say. Moeen Ali bats almost anywhere and often succeeds. The series is gone for England, but the final test gives time for pride.
He found the gap to perfection, Moeen Ali.
Jadeja to Johnny Bairstow, to Fielder.
In the air, gone.
Bairstow out for 49, heading back to the dressing room. Watch out. The bat is often an expression of emotion. Here it will be raised in celebration as Moeen Ali got to 100. India had dropped him on 0. England 284 for 4 at the close. Worth watching. So would you mind just that way? Where there's a window, there's always an opportunity. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
Now to the latest on the attempt by York Minster to ring the changes among its bell ringers. You may remember the whole team was sacked in October. Well, now the Minster has appealed for other ringers to help over Christmas. But they've had no luck, with fellow ringers pulling together and refusing to help out in an act of solidarity. Well, our correspondent Judith Moritz is outside the Minster for us now. And Judith, one is tempted to say it's a right old ding-dong.
You could say that, yeah. The Minster, in the last few minutes, have released a statement showing just how bitter this battle between bell ringers has become. They tell us that they've been trying to drum up support from bell ringers around the country to come in here and help ring the bells at Christmas. But that so far, some of those ringers have been subjected to intimidation on social media. One member of the clergy, apparently, who's offered to help, has been threatened with legal action. So what's going on? Well, it goes back to the Minster's decision to let its team of bell ringers go back in October. It's to do with concerns they had over the way that those volunteers are vetted, over safeguarding procedures. They still haven't sorted that out, but they wanted to in time for Christmas. This place has rung its bells every Christmas pretty much since the 14th century. At the moment, though, they aren't getting anywhere in terms of support. They have had people contacting them wanting to step in as well. The Minster say they hope that if somebody wants to get involved and is able to come here and has been cleared for working, that they can come forward and contact the Minster without fear of intimidation, and that they could approach them impartially. So it's still rumbling on this, as you say, a right old ding-dong, and another cliche for you, it'll be a silent night, possibly, at Christmas.
Judith, many thanks. Judith Morris there. Time for a look at the weather now. Here's Stav.
Hi there, Rita. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you home. I'll start by showing you the rainfall radar because we do have rain in the forecast. It's mainly across western areas. As you can see, it's been affecting Northern Ireland, some heavy bursts there. It's now pushing on in towards Scotland, affecting northwest England, northern and western Wales, and a few drips and drabs there for southwest England. But in the meantime, it's leaving in its wake plenty of sunshine behind it. So for Northern Ireland, a much brighter afternoon for you. Some of that brighter weather getting in towards the Outer Hebrides and in towards the west coast mainland of Scotland. But for Scotland, I think through the afternoon, it stays pretty drab and wet and on the cool side too. For Northern Ireland, there's that sunshine. Top temperatures 8 or 9 degrees. For Belfast, the rain will be in towards northwest England, northern and western Wales. And for England and Wales, generally, it should be largely dry, a lot of cloud around, a bit of mist and murk too, but also a few sunny spells here and there. And those temperatures across the south, 11 or 12 degrees. So still pretty mild for the time of year. That weather front continues to weaken as it moves southwards and eastwards this evening and overnight. Eventually there'll be a band of cloud with a bit of rain on it through central southern parts of the country, but further north with clear skies, it's going to turn much colder. In the rural places, we're likely to see a widespread frost for Scotland, Northern Ireland, and also for northern parts of England. But further south, a little less cold, a little bit milder. That means we start Saturday off on a cold but bright note across northern parts of the UK. Plenty of sunshine here through the day, though it will turn windier and cloudier across the northwest corner of Scotland. Here it'll be fairly mild. But I think across southern England, where we have that weak weather front here, largely cloudy, a bit of brightness around here, 10 or 11 degrees, but single figures further north. And it means with clear skies for much of the country, even across southern areas, we're likely to see those temperatures really fall away, some mist and fog forming too. And it will be a cold one for Sunday morning. But it does mean for Sunday morning it's going to be a bright start for many. A little bit of cloud here and there, mist and fog tending to clear away. The northwest corner of Scotland, or certainly for much of Scotland, it will be cloudier and windier here. And we're likely to see some pretty mild air pushing in here. So given some sunshine across the Moray Firth, for example, we could see 13 to maybe 15 Celsius. But elsewhere you can see it's a cooler day with temperatures in single figures for all. A peek into next week, high pressure holds on certainly for the first part of the week, but notice this pretty vigorous area of low pressure, which will come hurtling in midweek onwards to bring stronger winds and outbreaks of rain. So the main messages into next week, we start off on a settled note thanks to high pressure, mainly dry on the chilly side as well with light winds, but then it turns much wetter and much windier midweek onwards. That's how it's looking. Rita.
Thank you, Steph. A reminder now of our main story this lunchtime. Syria has suspended evacuations from eastern Aleppo amid claims that the rebels have broken the terms of the ceasefire. Well, that's all from the BBC News at 1, so it's goodbye from me. And on BBC One, we can now join the BBC's news teams where you are. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.